Hey everyone. So this video is actually a video I hope none of you ever has to use, but if you do, I wanted you to have this here as a reference for you or anyone you know who has these issues. This video is basically focused on what do you do or what are your options if something goes wrong in a class, as in there's a pattern of a class going off the rails, or of there being something that just doesn't feel right in a class or inappropriate in a class. And obviously that can cover a really wide range of issues, and often students feel extremely disempowered and don't know necessarily what their options are, who they should talk to, and what the range of their options are. For all kinds of reasons. Sometimes the bureaucracy is very opaque. Sometimes they don't get particularly clear answers. And often their points of contact for academic bureaucracy are their professors. And if their classes are themselves the area of conflict, they might not have a reliable person to ask. And frankly, the professors might not actually necessarily know who the most appropriate person to talk to would be in each instance. For example, when I was researching this video, I actually found out some things I didn't know, and I've been here for a few years. So it's not surprising that students often don't know, and sometimes actually might even be a little inadvertently or not so inadvertently misled as to what they should do if they find themselves in this position, which again, I hope you never do find yourself in this position. But if you do, I want you to be prepared. So basically the way that I organize this is by what the issues are that you might encounter in a class and who you should talk to. So basically there are, in most cases, 3 different entities you might find yourself needing to talk to if something is going kind of systemically wrong in a class you might be participating in. And so there are these 3 different entities, and they each kind of cover a different kind of range or type of questions. So depending on the type of issue that you are encountering, you may need to talk to your professor, which I know there are all kinds of reasons why you might not want to do that if they are the source of your discomfort. You might need to talk to the department chair, which I'll talk about in the middle, or you might need to talk to what would at BMCC be called the Office of Compliance and Diversity. Now, if you leave BMCC or are not at BMCC at the time that you see this video, there are other ways to find the equivalent office at other institutions, and I'll talk about that as well. But basically, those are the 3 major resources you would have to talk to if you have a particular issue with a class, but they don't cover the same particular concerns. So let's start. Okay, so kind of start, I won't necessarily say from the least to the most severe, but there are kind of different grades and types of issues that you might encounter. So let's start with the professor. I would say these different categories, we could think of rating them as from the proximity to the classroom might be the way to kind of think about it, because professor versus chair versus the Office of Compliance and Diversity, as you notice, you're getting further and further away from the classroom of origin. All right, so okay, so when to talk to the professor. There are some issues that might be going on in a classroom that are either sporadic or continuing or even systemic that require you to talk to the professor rather than other people. And I just wanted to cover this because sometimes I've found that people who are not faculty will sometimes recommend that you go to other places than the professor of record of a class to try to help students with things that actually no one but the professor can help with, and that can cause some problems. So for example, a couple of years ago, I had a student who was really stressed out about a class, did not talk to me, like never talked to me that he was stressed out. He wasn't turning in work because he was so stressed out. But from my end, all I could tell is that he wasn't turning in work, and he kept saying, oh, I'm going to turn it in, just something happened at work, I couldn't do it. And he went to his academic advisor, who then told him to talk to the chair of the department. Chair of the department literally couldn't help him, but then had to alert me that he had talked to her, and then that made him super uncomfortable because he felt like now I was going to be mad at him. Okay, that discomfort on the student's end was basically the result of a misunderstanding on the part of that academic advisor as to kind of how academic hierarchies work and what different people can do in that hierarchy and what they can't do. So there are certain things that only your professor can help you with. So for example, almost anything having to do with grading, you really only can deal with your professor. And part of that has to do with the way that academic departments are organized. So for example, in my department, in most departments, what you have is you have a lot of specialists. And so academic procedures often kind of come out of that structure. So even though we do a lot of generalist work, we also are specialists in kind of what you could think of as sort of like microfields. So for example, I'm a medievalist. My chair right now is a journalist. Let's say I was teaching a class on medieval literature. If a student didn't like their grade on a paper, right, on medieval literature, my chair, whose specialty is in journalism, is not necessarily going to be able to make the best evaluation of how that grade works, right? Just to give an example. Um, and so that's kind of led to a kind of logic that grades belong with the professor of record. Now, some institutions are a little bit more wobbly on that, but unless there's any clear evidence of clear unfairness, or let's say like bad math that a professor refuses to acknowledge, or just something extremely unreasonable that has nothing to do with the content of the class, very few chairs, department chairs, or even anyone up the ladder is likely to intervene in a grade, right? Unless that grade in some way violates some kind of larger university policy. Let's say they put in an attendance policy that is against the rules of the school, like maybe that they might intervene in. But anything having to do with like the grade on an assignment, anything like that, you're almost never going to get any luck kind of taking it up with the chair, right? Anything like that. So anything having to do with grades, hoping to get a grade change, if you think a grade is incorrect, if you want to know why something was graded the way it was, if you want to understand how to do better on a paper in the future, anything like that, you need to go to the professor of the class. And I do have a video on how to navigate those conversations to make them the least unpleasant possible. I know they're very uncomfortable, but there are ways to survive those conversations and possibly even build a stronger relationship with the professor. But those types of conversations need to happen with the professor. Conversations about, let's say you're in a class and the particular type of way that they're teaching is very difficult for you to absorb. Maybe they lecture all the time and that's really difficult, and you're hoping that maybe they could shake it up a little bit. That's something you need to take to the professor. A department chair does not have control over that. We have an idea called academic freedom. That kind of methodological approach, that kind of issue is really up to the professor. Now you can bring it up to the professor and ask if there's something they can do to kind of accommodate. They have the right to refuse or to just say, look, this is already planned out, my materials are done. But that's absolutely something you can bring up, and hopefully they will kind of think through it and shake it up a little bit. They may not. But that's something that really you can only bring to the professor unless there's something structural in the department that requires a particular type of methodological mix. You know, there's not much, there's nothing you can force, right? And you can't go to the department chair and say, but they have to. um, so you've got to kind of try to appeal to their better nature, and the only person you can go to is that person because they're in control of their own class. If you witness, or if you're in a class and you witness an uncomfortable or an inappropriate interaction or classroom dynamic, this one's tricky, right? Especially if that particular interaction originated with the professor themselves. For example, I just had a student in one of my classes when I was talking about making this video, and I had mentioned bullying as one thing that can happen. And she said, well, what if the bully is the teacher? And I said, yes, that would definitely be something you could complain about. The way that the complaint system works, at least at BMCC, is they prefer that you first try to address it with the professor. Now, I am fully aware that if your professor is bullying you, not only do you have the uncomfortable dynamic of a bully, there's also the power difference between you and the professor. And that definitely makes the idea of confronting, right, your bully, who is also your professor, extremely uncomfortable. However, the procedure that they would like you to go through is to try to address that with the professor. In the case of this student, she said, well, what happens if they make fun of you or they bully you, and when you try to call them out, they say it's just a joke? And I would say, if you're not laughing, it's not a joke, right? You can point that out, or you could just say, look, if you tell them you're uncomfortable and their response is, it's just a joke, at that point, I feel like you've done your due diligence. You've pointed out that you're not happy with that that you're not happy with this dynamic, and that you're not comfortable. They, as the person in power, have some responsibility for that dynamic and for creating an environment where it's possible for their students to learn. And a bullying environment, an environment where they think it's a joke and their students don't, is not a place where people are going to feel like they can learn, right? So at that point, I think you could take it to the next stage, which we'll talk about in a minute, which is going to the chair. All right, so that is something that you can try to address, I would say, verbally, either in class or in email after class. Outside of class or in office hours. If you don't want to confront them very directly, email is also an option that gives you the opportunity to choose your words very carefully, right? Kind of craft a response. I definitely do not recommend in many cases, complaining or bringing some of these concerns directly in front of class in most situations, because in many cases, you're likely to provoke a hostile or defensive response that is probably, not going to be particularly pleasant, because professors are people too, particularly someone who's already shown that they're willing to be pretty insensitive to the feelings of their students. Certainly in the case of the student who just basically said, hey, that wasn't funny, or I'm not enjoying that, and they're like, but it was a joke, or hey, that wasn't cool, and they're like, hey, it was a joke. Calling it out in that moment, I think, is perfectly appropriate. I would say at the point that the professor made it clear that they weren't going to kind of reevaluate that, which is probably a defensive moment, but that doesn't speak greatly, right? At that point, I would just kind of go, either if they feel like it, send an email after saying, I'd like to revisit this moment because it really wasn't great, or just say, you know what, no, we're taking this to the next step. Okay, other things you might want to take to the professor that are a little bit immediately contentious and hopefully a little bit more productive. If you're having difficulty with work or understanding the professor's expectations, if there feels like there's a miscommunication or a gap in communication, you need transparency in what's required of you to do well in a course. And communicating that kind of information as soon as possible, that's something that can only be done with your professor. A chair is not going to be able to get that for you because they're not the person teaching, administering, or grading the course. A tutor is not going to be able to do that. They are not the person teaching, administering, or grading the course. So that's something you really need to work on with the professor themselves. Basically, you want to talk to the professor for any issue related to the course, help that you need for the course, resources that are related to the course that they can guide you to, or clarifications about information, expectation, homework, etc., anything having to do with the course itself. Also, the professor is a person you obviously go to for things like extensions on your grades, or if you need to inform them about life events that might make it difficult for you to complete work on time, things like that. So if you need to plead for clemency, the only person who can really help you with that is the professor. The chair really can't make those decisions for them. Okay, so these are the types of things that you want to talk to the professor about as soon as possible, kind of in the moment, as soon as the pattern develops or the problem or concern develops. So they have to really happen during the course. Again, I would recommend generally addressing them during office hours, or set up a meeting if their office hours don't work for you. Or your last kind of option, especially if you're someone who gets very stressed out in the moment, would be to try to address these issues through an email where you can kind of craft your response without that kind of stressful sense of confrontation. So if that's something that really you're concerned about, email might be your best bet. The other positive of email, especially if it is a particular concern that you think might escalate or that you think might be an ongoing concern, is email leaves a paper trail. So especially if you see something that appears what we might consider to be inappropriate or abusive or bullying, documentation. So if somebody says something inappropriate or cruel, or, and not necessarily even to you, but to a classmate, documenting that. What day did that happen? What class did that happen? But also that might be something that you want to document in an email. Hey, I'd just like to circle back to what happened in class today. I was super uncomfortable about it. I don't understand how it could be a joke if the person you said it to didn't think it was funny. It wasn't funny to me. And I just really like you to rethink that, or something like that. Even if they kind of push back on that, you now have documentation. One, that it happened this day. Two, that they acknowledge that it happened that day. And then their response will really give you, hopefully closure in the moment. Maybe they really will rethink it, or evidence that there is this pattern if their response is super inappropriate. Okay, so those are the kinds of things that you might bring to a professor's attention during the course itself, so while the course is still active. There's another kind of point at which you can give feedback to the professor when something either isn't an emergency or it isn't at the point of a complaint, but you just want them to know. And that's when we have the end of semester course evaluations. So as a heads up, these course evaluations, you get an email in the last few weeks, really the last month of classes. And essentially it's a feedback form. It's asking for what things you felt worked, what things you felt didn't work. And basically the people who primarily see these, at least in the moment, are going to be the professor themselves and usually their supervisor, their chair. This is used in their annual evaluations if the person is untenured. In other words, they don't have a secured job um, or if they are adjunct faculty, which means that they're hired sometimes on a yearly or every 2 years, every 3 years, every 5 years type basis. These evaluations taken in the whole can have a big effect on, whether or not they're rehired. This is a really great place to kind of communicate and to kind of show patterns, right? Things that worked for you, things that didn't work for you, texts you liked, texts you didn't like, different activities that you felt were really effective or ineffective. This is a great place for those kinds of things that don't rise to, wow, this needs to be addressed really like right now, this needs to be fixed during the semester. But, I'd like you to know, hey, this really worked for me. This really didn't work for me. Or, in another semester, I'd really like you to rethink doing this, right? That is a great thing for you to use for evaluations. I think most students probably know this, but the evaluations are not released to the professors until all the end of semester grades are in, and they are completely anonymized. So in fact, the way that we receive them is we just get numbers because, you guys put in ratings, kind of like a Yelp review, and we just get the numbers. And if you've made any comments, any verbal comments, we just get those in a list. Those verbal comments are the most useful for professors to kind of guide their future conduct. And again, the more of those we get, the more we can identify patterns and try to make good choices for our future classes based on that. Just as a heads up. All right, so those are the ways that I would use talking to professors. Now, let's say you talk to your professor, you've made a kind of a good faith effort to talk to them about some of these issues, or the level of hostility, animosity, or behavior on the part of the professor is such that that talking to them is either futile or perhaps risky. Like you feel at risk in doing this. That would be a reason to go to the department chair. And then there are other kind of classes of issues that you would use to go to, or that would merit going to the department chair. So just to give you a little bit of an idea, the department chair is another faculty member in the same department, typically who is sometimes, depending on the institution, the chair is a rotating position, usually amongst the tenured members of the department or the senior members of the department. Sometimes they are voted in. At our institution, they are voted in by their peers, usually for a particular time period. And then sometimes that's repeating. And they act in a somewhat supervisory position over their peers. Okay, so they aren't exactly a boss, but they do have some authority. So they can make some kind of, we could think of as administrative decisions. They can discipline to a certain extent, or they can kind of push things up the ladder. But they're co-workers, and that can have an effect on the things that they can do, but also that they want or do not want to do. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, so after an attempt to address an issue with the professor has failed, or you have avoided it because it seems like it's unsafe or likely to end poorly, you might decide to go to the department chair. So this might be, again, like if you've had an uncomfortable or inappropriate interaction or dynamic in the classroom that went unaddressed or addressed ineffectively by the professor. This doesn't necessarily have to be an action by the professor themselves. Let's say there's a bullying mentality in the classroom by the other students, and the professor isn't handling it or isn't dealing with it. That's also something. Or if the professor encourages it or seems to be fine with it, that could be an issue. If they are encouraging an environment that makes it hard for people to learn, that's a problem. So that might be a reason you would go to the chair of the department. The way you would find the chair is you would go usually to your institution's website. Typically, there will be a link for academics. Sometimes you have to go to students, and then under students it says academics. Sometimes it just goes straight to academics. And usually under that, there will be links for academic departments. Click on that, find the department that the class is taught under, and then typically there will be a personnel section. The chair will almost always be listed top, or there will be a star, or it'll have comma chair. Look for the department chair, click on them. There will usually be information for how to contact them. Sometimes in larger departments, you may have to contact their administrative assistant or the department's administrative assistant so that they can make an appointment. But you can usually just email them directly and say, hey, I'm a student in, let's say it's English class X, section X, and I'd like to talk to you about an experience I had that I'm upset about, or I'd like to talk to you about this issue. If you want to make a meeting with them and talk to them verbally, or if you want a paper trail, you could actually, just explain the issue through email directly. Either of those works. Okay. So one thing you might do is if it's basically an escalation of a when to talk to the professor issue, you could talk about that. If you've documented, this is a great time to give dates and times. But there are other things that you might go to the chair about. So for example, if the professor is not fulfilling their professional obligations, now what might that mean? If they aren't coming to class, or if they're coming to class very late or leaving early consistently, if they aren't holding scheduled office hours consistently, if they aren't replying to emails, and I don't mean not replying within a day. Typically, most schools have you should be able to expect generally a reply within about 48 hours. Sometimes weekends or holidays might get in the way of that a little bit, but generally you should expect a reply to an email within 48 hours from your professor. If there is a pattern, not just once, but a pattern of not getting replies to emails, and I've heard some stories, right? That's something to talk to the chair about. If they aren't grading work, if they aren't giving homework, like let's say there's work on the syllabus, but you guys aren't getting it, or you turned in something 6 weeks ago and it hasn't been graded. How are you supposed to know how you're doing in the class? How are you supposed to make adjustments? These are things to, one, send an email to the professor, right? But also it's something to talk to the chair about, because this is clearly going to interfere with your ability to do well in the course. So not grading in a reasonable or a reasonably timely manner, not showing up for either the course or your office hours, changing the modality of the course. So let's say your course is scheduled to be in person, but you show up the first day and they say, well, actually it's going to be hybrid. You didn't sign up for a hybrid course. That is an immediate go to the chair of the department. Right, because you didn't consent to that. Similarly, let's say you had an asynchronous class and they're like, actually, we're going to be meeting on campus. You didn't agree to that. That's not what you signed up for. So those kinds of things would be immediately go to the department chair so that you can get that fixed. Extreme deviation from the syllabus. So, the syllabus at the beginning, we usually will have something saying, hey, some of this may change depending on, how things are going. Obviously, sometimes the class may go a little faster or a little bit slower than expected, and that might change the syllabus a little bit. But let's say your class doesn't even resemble the syllabus. That's something to talk to the professor about, because there's something hinky going on. So these are all issues. Again, you want to document the problem. You don't kind of want to go in with an amorphous issue. You want to be able to explain, look, here's the syllabus, but this is what we're doing. Or, hey, I turned this work in on X date. Look at the date today. I still haven't received any grade on it. What am I supposed to do? That kind of information. Or, hey, for the last 3 weeks, I've been trying to go to office hours. they're not there. It's scheduled, but they aren't attending. Or they've missed 3 classes in a row. Where's my class? Like that kind of information. The department needs to know that your class isn't essentially running the way it's been promised to you or to them. Okay, so those are all things to talk to the department chair. Now, there is an official process to go through in this case. Basically, the way that CUNY wants this process to go is that you make an informal complaint to the department chair, and they will attempt to address it. If it isn't satisfactory, dealt with in a satisfactory way, then you make a formal complaint, after which the chair will, quote, try to investigate. And the idea is that they will inform the faculty member that there is an investigation of this issue. That faculty member is forbidden to retaliate, and the chair is supposed to report back their findings within 30 days. In practice, I have heard of cases, particularly when someone makes a kind of report against a tenured faculty member, where chairs have said things like, oh, well, there's nothing I can do, they're tenured. This is, in fact, not true. Formal complaints absolutely can be made against tenured members, and the formal complaints create a paper trail. I don't know if if the related chairs literally didn't know, or if they didn't want to be in the uncomfortable position of investigating someone that they expected to be colleagues with for the next 15 or 20 years. But the fact is, it is your right to make an informal and or formal complaint. And if you encounter that kind of response from a chair when you try to make a complaint, you also have the option, when the person you're complaining against is a department chair, to go to the academic dean instead. If you try to go to a chair and make a formal complaint and they refuse and say that they can't, I would then say that your best option would be then to go to the academic dean and explain, one, that you tried to make a formal complaint against a faculty member, and that, two, this chair refused and said it was impossible. And that violates, CUNY policy. You should not have to deal with that, but I would say that's your workaround if that happens to you. Hopefully it would not. Hopefully you never find yourself in a situation where that could happen to you. But that's, I'd say, what you would do. Similarly, if the person you would be complaining about, let's say because they also teach, is the chair of an academic department, again, you would go to an academic dean, because obviously you can't go to the chair to investigate themselves. Okay, so that covers a lot of the issues. However, there's a large category of issues where you would bypass the professor and the department chair altogether. And that is when there is a pattern or an incident, but usually a pattern either, of abusive or discriminatory behavior by the professor, or tolerance of such behavior by the professor against what we would call a protected group, or status that creates a hostile or dangerous learning environment. So in this case, we could be talking about gender presentation or identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, religion, immigration status, anything like that, anything we might think of as like identity, right? And for any of those kinds of issues where the pattern of behavior, the pattern of inappropriate behavior or interaction or dynamic, whether it's by the students but tolerated by the professor or by the professor themselves, that's creating a hostile learning environment. If that is the issue that's going wrong in the classroom, you don't go to the professor and you don't go to the department chair, you go to the Office of Compliance and Diversity, and they will do the investigation uh, and kind of take it from there. Again, document. And in the case of either a formal complaint to the chair or a formal complaint to the Office of Compliance and Diversity, you can get witnesses. Those witnesses have to also be members of the same class, right? Which makes sense, because if they're going to be witnesses of behavior in a classroom, they have to be other students in the same class. But the big thing there is you want to have records of dates and times and specific behaviors, because that's the kind of thing that they can then try to verify with other witnesses. Did this happen? When did it happen? Etc. Okay, so this might be a little bit repetitive, but I just wanted to show you I have, and I will be sharing this with my classes. But I do have a kind of quick reference that tries to bring this information together. Basically, who to talk to and when to talk to them about which types of issues. And if you run into any of these cases or any of these issues now or in the future, you are more than welcome to email me if you have any trouble figuring out how to contact any of these entities or getting any of these documents. So for example, if you want the document about CUNY policies on the procedures for making a formal complaint, all of that kind of thing, I can link you to that PDF. If you have trouble finding the Office of Compliance and Diversity, I can send you that link. I'm more than welcome or more than happy to do that for you. And you can email me anytime. But I hope that's helpful to you. I hope it is a resource you never have to use, but if you do, I hope you find it useful. Okay, have a great day, and I will see you in class.